Well, we find ourselves at a Christmas edition of our Bible study, our study in the book of Romans. So I thought I would hang out here by the fire and Mickey and Minnie, and we'll have a little study. It's going to be interesting because the environment is going to be a juxtaposition to the content that we're going to be talking about right now in Romans. We're going to be taking a look at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23. And this is still the introduction of Paul to the church in Rome. For remember, Paul has never met the church in Rome. He's never been there. He's hoping to be there someday. He's hoping to launch his ministry into Spain from Rome, and he wants to go and to be with them and to spend time with them. But before he gets there, he is sending them a letter as an introduction, as a teaching opportunity. And so we're still in the very beginnings. We're still in the greeting part where Paul is introducing himself and introducing the concepts like the good news of God, which is Jesus Christ. And we're going to pick up in verses 18 through 23, and we're going to be taking a look at something that is very, very hard for us to deal with, and that is the concept of God's wrath. So we start off this study with a question for you to ponder, and that is, at this very moment, at this very place, how do you understand God's wrath? It's a tough question, isn't it? For some people watching right now, you don't consider or understand God's wrath at all. You just don't think about it. You're more focused on God's love and God's grace and God's forgiveness than God's wrath. And you kind of brush over that subject and you move away from it as quickly as you can. Some of you watching this right now might be people who have grown up in a tradition or been seeped in a tradition that is filled with God's wrath. That you better watch out, you better not cry, you better not pout. I'm telling you why. Santa Claus is coming to town. God is coming to town, and you don't want to be on his bad side. Maybe that is the way that you've been conditioned in your relationship with God. Still, others of you are watching this right now. You have a healthy relationship with God's wrath. You understand that God's wrath is a part of God's nature, just like wrath is a part of your nature. We are created in God's image, and each and every single one of us understands what it's like to feel wrath. We understand what it's like to get upset over evil, to get upset over meanness or mean-spiritedness, or to get upset over decisions that are just not right. And so this God's wrath is a part of the nature of God, and wherever you fall on the spectrum, you've got to deal with it. You've got to wrestle with God's wrath. So this is an invitation today as we move into the Christmas and New Year season for you to embrace the love of God shown in Jesus Christ, embrace the love of God and the possibility of a new year, but also embrace the love of God when it comes to God's wrath. And we're going to be looking at that today in this passage. Also, too, we want to remember as we're looking at this passage that Paul is talking to the church in Rome. So his audience that he's writing to are Gentile believers in Jesus and Jewish believers in Jesus. He's not writing a letter to people who don't believe, trying to convince them to believe or trying to lead them into faith. He's already dealing with people who claim to have a faith in Jesus, and now they are needing to be taught. They're needing to go deeper. And that meets us right where we are. Maybe today you're one of those kind of people that has had a relationship with Jesus Christ for as long as you can remember. Maybe have gone to church for as long as you can remember. But you honestly admit that your relationship with God, your relationship with Jesus is not that deep. It's kind of on the surface level. Yeah, you know who he is. Yeah, you understand. But you really never have plunged to the depths. Well, I'm glad you're joining us for the study in Romans, because we're going to be plunging to a lot of depths in these 16 chapters of the letter to the Romans. And we're going to start now with God's wrath. So we're going to take a look, and we're going to break this passage up into two sections. First, we're going to look at 18 through 20, and then we're going to look at 21 through 23. So let's first take a look at verses 18 through 20, and let's listen to the word of the Lord. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. Now you see why it was important for us to start to wrestle with this concept of our understanding of the wrath of God, because how does Paul start verse 18? The wrath of God is being revealed. And so when you see that in the Bible, you've got to deal with it. You can't skip over it. So we've got to come to terms with this understanding of the wrath of God. And what does this mean, this wrath of God? Well, listen to this verse more. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. So this is not saying the wrath of God is revealed on everybody. It's saying the wrath of God is revealed in creation, revealed in our reality today against the godlessness. Do you have that in your translations? Godlessness. This is an important concept, for this godlessness is the absence of God. Well, if we have an absence of God in our life, then the only thing that can fill that space is wickedness. And listen to his words again. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Excuse me. And so what we have here is this reality that if you take God out of the equation, you leave a vacuum. And remember, humans cannot stand vacuums. We don't like vacuums. We don't like aspects of our life that we can't explain. Oh, excuse me. We don't like aspects of our life that we don't understand. We struggle with living in the I don't know. We struggle with living in the without. But the thing that we have to understand as followers of Jesus, and remember, and that's who the audience is, followers of Jesus, just like you watching this right now might be a follower of Jesus. As a follower of Jesus, we need to get good at living in the I don't know, to get good at living in the without, to get good at being in that place where we acknowledge and we confess that we don't have it all figured out and we need help. We need to lean into something greater than ourselves. Well, if we deny that, and we remove that need to lean into something greater than us, we remove that concept of I don't know or living in the without. If we remove that, then we've got to fill that void with something. And what do we fill it with? We fill it with wickedness. Left to our own devices, you and I are going to mess things up. History has proven that over and over and over again, from Adam and Eve all the way up to today. And so this wickedness that we replace this godlessness with is the sense of saying God's out of the equation, thus I'm inserting me. I'm inserting my desires. I'm inserting my wants. I'm inserting my perspectives into the place where God's wants, God's needs, and God's perspectives belong. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. And so this wrath of God, first and foremost, we've got to understand the wrath of God is being shown, being revealed against godlessness. That means the removal of God. Now think about it for a second. You're in a relationship with someone, you're in a family or you have friends, and then all of a sudden out of the blue, that family or that friends basically disowns you. They acknowledge that they know who you are, but they don't have anything to do with you. Well, don't you think that's going to cause a little wrath in your life? Of course. Well, where did that come from? It comes from this understanding that we are created in the image of God. For God's children, when they deny God, it causes God to deal with wrath. God's wrath is brought upon people who don't acknowledge Jesus or don't acknowledge God. It's like that Brennan Manning quote that I have said many, many times before, and that is, what an unbelieving world finds simply unbelievable are Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and then walk out the door and deny him by their lifestyles. And so this is what is godlessness. And so Paul is starting off these verses today with this warning about the wrath of God against godlessness. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since, in verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. And this is a nod to the fact and the reality of Paul's perspective. Now, you can disagree with Paul's perspective, but you need to hear it first before you disagree with it. And that is, Paul's perspective is that every single human being that has ever lived and will ever live does not need to be told about God. All they need to do is to experience the wonder of creation. And using some examples, to be at the Gulf of Mexico for a sunset, to stand on the rim of the Grand Canyon, to be in the room when a baby is born. Faith or no faith, believer or atheist, everybody has the same response. Oh my God. When they see something so wonderful and so awesome as a sunset over the Gulf or the rim of the Grand Canyon or a baby being born, or you name it, you can fill in the blank with many different things. There is this understanding rooted in our DNA, because we're made in the image of God, that we understand that what we're experiencing and what we're seeing and what we're feeling is the result of something so much more powerful than us. We see this every day in our everyday life as we're cruising through the channels. You come across the History Channel or other channels and you'll see these, ancient aliens or UFO investigations. Think about it for a second. We either as creatures have the biggest inferiority complex, or we truly understand deep down in our DNA that there's something greater out there than us. For every alien, every UFO, every extraterrestrial is far superior to us. Far superior to us in knowledge, far superior to us in technology. And so we understand something so much bigger than us. It's a part of who we are. It's how we've been created. Now, we don't understand what God has been from the beginning to the end, but we understand that there is a God, and we see that God revealed every single day in creation around us. The beauty of the earth that we live in, the wonder of the air that we breathe, the amazement of the stars in the sky. We all understand that there is a God. Now, we might not call that understanding God. We might call that understanding by another name, or call the higher power, or whatever the case may be. But each and every single one of us, based on Paul's perspective, and this is what we're reading, is Paul's perspective in Romans, based on his perspective, every single human being understands God. Listen to his words again. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. And so this is that basic understanding of the fact that every single human being understands that there is a God, however they want to define that, or however they want to formulate that. And we see this in history. You go back through history all the way back to the original cultures in Mesopotamia. And what do they do in those cultures, those primitive cultures from our perspective? They all create religions. They all create gods, because there's something in us as human beings that we understand that there's something greater out there that has created all of this, has given all of this, has power and dominion over all of this, us included. And so that's just a part of who we are. And so Paul is saying that we don't have any excuse. Thus, the reason for God's wrath when we do walk away from God, when we do practice, as it says, godlessness, which leads to wickedness. That brings upon us God's wrath. So now let's look at verses 21 through 23. For although they know God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Now, before we get into this, that we have to understand that last verse was really a smack in the face to the Greco-Roman culture, because this is a church in Rome in the height of the Roman government, in the height of the Roman Empire, and there is this pantheon of gods in Rome that people worship. You've got Zeus, and you've got Hermes, and you've got Aphrodite, and you've got all of these different gods that are referenced in the Greco-Roman world. And so Paul is making a direct affront on that culture, basically saying in these words, and exchange the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being and birds and animals and reptiles. Now, even though that is a direct, full frontal assault on the Roman culture at that time, it's also something that we can read in 2020 and we can relate to. Because remember, when we take God out of the equation, we create a vacuum, because there's something in us that says there is a God. There's something in us that says there's something more powerful than me, greater than me out there somewhere. There's something inside of us that acknowledges the I don't know, acknowledges the fact that we live without. And if we take God out of the equation, then we've got to insert something else into that equation. And what that something else in that equation, when we insert it, brings about wickedness. And we can insert many things in that. We can insert other gods into that. We can insert money into that. We can insert sex or drugs or alcohol into that. We can insert so many different things into that place of godlessness, which will bring about the wickedness that the wrath of God is focused on. And that is this separation that we have from God. Remember, we've defined sin in the past as sin is anything that separates us from God. So if you're consciously making a choice to say, I don't believe in God, I don't believe there's a God, and I will worship money, or I will worship my spouse, or I will worship some other human being, or I will worship a cow or an elephant. Whatever you do, that's going to bring about wickedness because it's godlessness. It's taking God out of the equation. And so what Paul is saying here at the very end of these verses, verse 23, to the Romans in the Roman church, that be aware of the culture that's around you, because all of those statues and all of those temples that you have around you, that's godlessness. That's going to bring about wickedness. It's only the one true God that makes the connection. It's only the one true God that we serve. And we might think to ourselves, like, why is he saying this, or why is he teaching this to a group of people he believes are already followers? And that is because he's never been with them before. He's never met them before. He's never taught them before. So when you don't have a relationship like that, you've got to start at the beginning. You've got to start at the 101. And thank God that he starts at the 101, because it's important for us to constantly revisit this and to make sure, because the best of intentions, followers of Jesus will often in our lives veer off the course, and we'll find ourselves serving another God. We'll find ourselves living in godlessness. And not that we're doing it intentionally, not that we get up one morning and say, you know what, I'm going to be godless today. But we get up in the morning and we go about our day. We go about our normal life, and things come in. Financial stress comes in, pandemics come in, marital stress comes in, health issues come in. All of the different aspects of life start to come in, and all of a sudden we see our focus start to shift from heavenward to earthly word. Heavenward to earthly word. I don't think that's a word. But anyways, we start focusing on our world right around us, and we get kind of caught in that. And all of a sudden, the next thing we know, a day, a week, a month, a year, 2 years, 10 years have passed by, and we find ourselves more focused on godlessness than on godliness. And then we see that there is basically a wake of wickedness that comes behind us. Decisions that are made out of wrong motivations, relationships that have developed for the wrong reasons. And all of these things start to pile up. And so what Paul is saying to the church in Rome, the believers, is he's saying, be very careful. We need to live in the world, but we are not to live of the world. It's a totally different relationship. And so he's giving them this reminder at the very beginning of this letter, for he doesn't know this group. So he's got to start at the very beginning. So let's jump back up in verse 21. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Remember, godlessness is the sin. It's the root sin. Godlessness, removing God from the equation. Sin is anything that separates you from God. So if you make the conscious decision to remove God from the equation of your life, then that godlessness, that sin, will have as its effect wickedness. And that wickedness will come into play in our lives and in the world. And so understanding that is the foundation. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And so this, in essence, is the reason for God's wrath. God's wrath is there because of the fact that there are his creation, his children, human beings that say, oh yes, I know there's a God, but I make the conscious choice not to follow him. I make the conscious choice not to believe in him. I make the conscious choice not to have anything to do with him. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. Remember, the sin of godlessness will lead to wickedness, and that wickedness will be seen in our lives as thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So we have to take a moment and take a look at this concept of darkened. Darkened hearts, hardened hearts, these are terms that we see over and over again in Scripture. And sometimes we struggle with what this means, because did God harden their heart? Did God darken their hearts? Or are their hearts hardened in response to some sin in their life? Are their hearts darkened in response to some sin in their life? And we see very clearly here in this passage what Paul is sharing with us is that hearts get darkened not because God is up in heaven going dark heart, dark heart, dark heart, hard heart, hard heart. He's not doing that. What God is experiencing is people who are making conscious choices, people who are choosing to be godless, and the wickedness is coming in because once God is removed from the equation, the heart gets dark. Once God is removed from the equation, the heart gets hard. And so this hard heart, this dark heart that we see here in verse 21, these are in response to the godlessness and the wickedness that people have in their lives. The wickedness that they have in their lives because of the fact that they've made a choice to remove God from the equation. So the hearts are not darkened because God is doing it. The hearts are darkened because of the decisions people are making to remove God from the equation. And the thing that's interesting in this is that many times we will find that God gets blamed for darkened hearts. So someone makes a choice to remove God from the equation of their life, which leads to wickedness in their life. And that wickedness in their life leads to their hearts being darkened and them doing things that hurt other people. Them committing crimes, them hurting other people, holding compassion, holding generosity. This wickedness leads to behaviors that basically affect other people. And then when people see the effect on other people, they get mad at God and they say, why did God allow that? Well, understand this very clearly, is that we have been given the responsibility and the opportunity to make a choice, make a decision. Remember, a yes is not powerful unless there's the possibility of no. And so if the only answer that's possible is yes, there's no power in that. But if we all have the decision or the choice or the opportunity to say no, then the decision to say yes is that much more powerful. And so this understanding here of the wrath of God is being shown towards people who have made a conscious decision to say no to God. And then God's wrath comes out of that. Not that God is up in heaven waiting to punish all the people who are against him, but also, too, there's this understanding that God is all powerful and God can do anything that God wants, but for whatever reason, God chooses not to intervene in certain situations. And so this is one of those concepts that we'll never fully understand until that day that we're in glory with God. But by the time that comes, we won't care anymore. And if someone could figure that out, they would write a book and we'd all know how to answer these questions. But the thing that we know for sure is that hearts are darkened not because of God, but because of the decisions that we make. That the wrath of God is shown to people who have godlessness in their life, who have removed God from the equation. Now, you might say, well, gosh, Pastor, I know many God-fearing people who have suffered great tragedies. Well, yes, there's many reasons for that. One of the reasons for that is that we live in a fallen world. When Adam and Eve committed the sin of eating the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, death came into the world. So at that moment, coronavirus came into the world, cancer came into the world, heart disease came into the world. Now, all of that stuff was entered into the world for the body started to break down. Because remember, one of the punishments for sin was that they were removed from the Garden of Eden. And what was the tree in the Garden of Eden that they could eat from? It was the tree of life. Yes, so as long as Adam and Eve, as long as creation was in the Garden of Eden with access to the tree of life, life was forever. You didn't age. You didn't get sick. You didn't grow old. But once we were removed from the tree of life because of the sin, the godlessness that came into the world, then we no longer had that access to life. We no longer had that access to youth. And our bodies began to age and our bodies began to break down. So yes, a natural progression, whether a follower of Jesus or not, whether a passionate believer or not, is that our bodies break down. We get sick. But then you might be saying, well, this is not sickness. This is something that happened to them as random chance. They were driving down the highway one night trying to get home, and there was a wrong way driver who was drunk coming the other way and hit them head on, and they died. Why didn't God stop that? Well, remember again what we're talking about in this passage. the wrath of God is shown to godless people. And godless people, people who have removed God from the equation, find themselves living in wickedness. And so there's a very good possibility that the person or persons that were on the other end of whatever tragedy you're thinking of were people that had removed God from the equation, thus wickedness became a part of their life. And again, remember, a yes is not powerful unless the possibility of no is there. So a relationship that we choose to be in with God is not powerful unless we also have the freedom to choose not to be in that relationship. So God can not only not remove the power for someone to make a decision no, God cannot intervene and interfere with that person's ability to carry out their decision. For if God just intervened and created a cushion around all followers, then the decision to not follow God would not be one that had any power to it. It would not be one that would have any truth to it at all, because it was just a facade, because God would protect all of the followers. So there must be the possibility for tragedy. There must be the possibility for catastrophe to happen, because that is an example of God showing his love to creation. For he gives us the right to make decisions, fully knowing that every decision we make will have consequences. And so what he's saying in this passage here, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. And darkened hearts, foolish, darkened hearts that come from a place of wickedness, which comes from a place of godlessness, is the root problem of many of the things that we experience in life. Just watch the news and you will see individual people who made decisions. They made decisions to act in a certain way, to take certain steps, and those had consequences in other people's lives. And many times those other people that were affected by those consequences were people who were totally innocent. They did nothing. Well, and understanding the holiness of God, understanding the goodness of God, God can't merely willy-nilly intervene and stop all bad things happening for followers of Jesus, but allowing bad things to happen to people who choose not to follow Jesus. Because then free will is taken out of the equation. Then the power of a relationship that is a relationship of choice is taken out of the equation. So this is a deep one. Again, we're only in the first chapter of Romans, and this is how deep Paul is getting with them. But let's move on. Verse 22, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. They claimed to be wise, they became fools. One of the things that we understand in the concept of godlessness is that when we take God out of the equation, we're replacing God with ourselves. Yes, we might be replacing God with an idol. We might be replacing God with money or sex or something else like that. But we're replacing God with something of our choosing. So basically, we're creating life in our image as opposed to being a creation in God's image. And so this is foolishness of us to think that we can truly master our own reality, that we can truly master our own universe. So although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. I know what I'm doing. I know how to handle this. Well, remember, being a follower of Jesus means that you get good at living in the I don't know. You get good at living in the without, leaning into this need that we have for God. Well, if we take God out of the equation, then we take that leaning out. We get rid of the I don't know, we get rid of the without, and we fool ourselves, or we trick ourselves into believing that we've got it all figured out, that we can handle it. Well, that makes us fools. Verse 23, and exchange the glory of a mortal God for images made to look like a mortal human being, and birds and animals and reptiles. And again, as we talked about, a direct reference to the culture of the Roman church, the culture that's all around them, that culture of the Greek pantheon of gods, these man-made created gods that were really, in essence, when you think about it, gods that were created in our image, as opposed to that truth being reversed and us being created in God's image. Now, that's where we're going to stop off today. We're going to leave off in verse 23. We'll pick up in verse 24, and we'll pick up in verse 24 next year. We're going to take a little break over Christmas and New Year's, and I pray that you get a chance to enjoy your family, whether live or virtually. I pray you get a chance to find a place to worship on Christmas and New Year's. If you don't have a church home, it's important that you find one, at least for the holidays. Try out a place and hear the good news and worship with other people. Even if you're doing it virtually, worship with other people. It's so important during this season. And we will get back together at the beginning of January, and we're going to jump into verse 24. So until then, I pray that you stay safe. I pray that you stay sane. I pray that you have a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. And you've got a couple weeks, so start thinking about who you can invite to join you with this study in the new year. Nothing better than starting off a new year with a new study. So I invite you to invite your friends to share this with other people. Have a great Christmas and a great New Year's, and we'll see you next year.